When the CEO's son fired me in front of the entire board to impress his father, he had no idea I was the only person alive who knew the passwords to their $847 million Swiss accounts. What happened next destroyed his family's empire and changed everything I thought I knew about justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany conference table stretched endlessly before me, its surface reflecting the crystal chandelier that had witnessed countless million-dollar decisions. I'd sat at this table for 7 years, watching Blackstone Financial grow from a mid-tier investment firm into a global powerhouse. The irony wasn't lost on me that today, in this same room where I'd helped orchestrate some of the most complex offshore financial maneuvers in the industry, I was about to become the victim of the most amateur power play I'd ever witnessed. Marcus Blackstone Jr. sat across from me, his Armani suit perfectly pressed, his Harvard MBA practically radiating from his smug expression. 28 years old, never worked anywhere else, never earned anything that wasn't handed to him on a platinum platter. Behind him, his father, Charles Blackstone Sr., observed with the calculated stillness of a man who'd built an empire by knowing when to speak and when to let others hang themselves with their own words. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Margaret Chen, the head of operations, avoided my gaze. David Rodriguez from legal kept checking his phone. Even Patricia Walsh, who'd been my mentor when I first joined as a junior financial analyst fresh out of Northwestern, stared at her hands folded neatly on the table. Marcus cleared his throat with theatrical precision, the same way he did everything designed for maximum impact and minimum substance. Before we discuss the quarterly offshore portfolio performance, he began, his voice carrying that entitled tone I'd grown to despise. I have an announcement regarding personnel changes that will take effect immediately. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that always preceded Marcus's power plays. For months, I'd watched him systematically undermine my authority, questioning my decisions in meetings, CCing his father on emails that painted my strategic recommendations as overly cautious. The writing had been on the wall, written in expensive ink with the Blackstone family seal. Effective immediately, Marcus continued, pulling out a cream-colored envelope with the company letterhead. Elena Rodriguez is no longer with Blackstone Financial in any capacity. The silence that followed was deafening. Not the productive quiet of people processing important information, but the uncomfortable hush that falls over a room when everyone realizes they're witnessing something that shouldn't be happening in public. I stared at the envelope, then at Marcus, whose blue eyes glittered with satisfaction. This was his moment, his chance to prove to Daddy that he could make the tough decisions, that he was ready to inherit the kingdom. What he didn't understand was that kingdoms built on secrets require someone to guard those secrets, and he was about to eliminate the only guardian who knew where all the keys were hidden. Your severance package is generous, Marcus added, sliding the envelope across the polished wood toward me. Legal has already approved everything. We appreciate your years of service. Years of service. As if I'd been fetching coffee instead of architecting the entire offshore financial infrastructure that had made his family fortune possible. As if I hadn't spent countless late nights in Geneva, Zurich, and the Cayman Islands, building relationships with private bankers who trusted me personally, not the Blackstone name. As if the intricate web of shell companies, trust structures, and numbered accounts that protected their wealth from both market volatility and government oversight had somehow created itself. I picked up the envelope, feeling its weight. Inside would be a non-disclosure agreement thick as a phone book, a healthy severance check, and probably some legal language about non-compete clauses. Standard procedure for removing someone who knew too much. Except Marcus had made one crucial miscalculation. He thought he knew how much I knew. Standing slowly, I straightened my charcoal blazer and looked directly at him. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said, my voice steady and professional. Then, as I turned toward the door, I paused and pivoted slightly. "Oh, Marcus, one small thing before I go." His eyebrows raised with mild curiosity, probably expecting some final plea or expression of gratitude. "You might want to call Heinrich Müller in Zurich before the markets open tomorrow." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus blinked, his confident expression flickering like a candle in the wind. Excuse me? I met his gaze directly, allowing the slightest smile to touch the corner of my mouth. The authentication protocols for the primary vault accounts expire at midnight Central European Time. Heinrich was very specific about the renewal procedures. That's when I saw at the exact moment when arrogance cracked and revealed the frightened child underneath. Marcus's face went pale, and his eyes darted toward his father, who was now leaning forward with the intensity of a predator sensing danger. "What are you talking about?" Marcus demanded, but his voice had lost its authoritative edge. "I'm talking about the fact that you just fired the only person in this room who knows the master passwords for your Swiss accounts." I adjusted my purse strap over my shoulder. All $847 million of them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The explosion of activity that followed was almost comedic. Margaret Chen frantically opened her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. David Rodriguez was already dialing numbers on his phone. Patricia Walsh looked like she was about to be sick. And Charles Blackstone Sr., for the first time in the 7 years I'd known him, looked genuinely concerned. But Marcus just stared at me with a mixture of disbelief and growing horror, as the full implications of what he'd just done began to sink in. "You're bluffing," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. "Am I?" I replied calmly. "Go ahead and try to access the Helvetica Trust accounts, or the Geneva Holdings portfolio, or any of the 17 numbered accounts we set up last year to shelter the acquisition funds from the Meridian deal." By now, Margaret had pulled up the banking portal on her laptop, her fingers trembling as she entered login credentials. The screen flashed red. Access denied. She tried again, using Charles Sr.'s credentials. Same result. "This is impossible," Marcus sputtered. "We have backup procedures, security protocols." "You have procedures that I designed," I corrected him. "Security protocols that I implemented. And master passwords that I created using an encryption method that only I understand. Did you really think I'd spend 7 years building your financial fortress without ensuring I held the keys?" I walked toward the door, my heels clicking against the marble floor with metronomic precision. Behind me, the conference room erupted into chaos-raised voices, panicked phone calls, and the distinctive sound of expensive suits rustling as powerful people realized they were no longer in control. "Elena!" Charles Sr., his voice boomed across the room, carrying all the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We need to talk." I paused at the doorway, one hand on the brass handle. "No, Charles, you need to listen. There's a difference." "This is extortion," Marcus shouted, his composure finally completely shattered. I turned back to face him, and for the first time since walking into that conference room, I allowed my professional mask to slip just enough to let him see the steel underneath. "No, Marcus, this is consequences. You wanted to play power games with someone you thought was powerless. Turns out, you don't understand power at all." The elevator doors closed behind me just as I heard Charles Sr.'s hassle voice escalating to a volume I'd never heard from him before. As the car descended toward the lobby, I pulled out my phone and checked the time. 2:47 p.m. The Swiss banks would be closing soon, and tomorrow would bring a very different conversation. Blackstone Financial hadn't always been housed in a gleaming Manhattan tower with views of Central Park. When I joined 7 years ago, they operated out of a converted brownstone in the financial district, the kind of place where you could still smell the history in the wood paneling and feel the weight of old money in every handshake. I was 26 then, brilliant with numbers, but naive about everything else. Fresh from Northwestern with a master's in international finance, and stars in my eyes about working on Wall Street. Charles Sr. interviewed me personally, a rarity for someone at my level. I still remember sitting across from his desk, nervous and eager, while he asked me questions that seemed to have nothing to do with financial analysis. "Tell me about trust, Elena," he'd said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Not the legal instrument, the human concept." I'd given him some textbook answer about reliability and confidence, but he'd shaken his head. "Trust," he'd said, "is the currency of our business, more valuable than gold, more volatile than cryptocurrency, and more dangerous than plutonium if it falls into the wrong hands. I thought I understood what he meant. I didn't. My first assignment was mundane portfolio analysis for domestic clients, the kind of work any competent analyst could handle, but within 6 months, Patricia Walsh noticed something that would change everything. I had a gift for pattern recognition, an almost supernatural ability to see connections in financial data that others missed. More importantly, I had an eidetic memory for numbers. Show me an account number once, and I'd remember it forever. Give me a complex password, and it would be burned into my brain like a brand. That's when Charla Sr. started bringing me into the real business. The first offshore account I helped establish was for a tech executive who'd made a fortune in the dot-com boom and wanted to shelter his wealth from both his ex-wife's lawyers and the IRS. Nothing illegal, just complex. We created a web of trusts and shell companies that spanned 3 jurisdictions, each layer adding another degree of separation between the man and his money. I was fascinated by the architecture of it, the way you could build these elaborate financial structures that existed in the spaces between laws, perfectly legal but nearly invisible. It was like constructing buildings in the 4th dimension, creating something solid and functional that most people couldn't even perceive. Charla Sr. watched me work with the intensity of a master craftsman evaluating a promising apprentice. "You have a mind for this," he told me after I successfully navigated my first major offshore setup, "but more importantly, you understand discretion." That was the key, he explained. Anyone could learn the mechanics of international banking, the regulations and procedures that governed money movement across borders. But very few people could be trusted with the knowledge of who owned what, where it was hidden, and how to access it. That kind of information was power in its purest form, and power corrupted everyone eventually. "Everyone except you," he'd said, though at the time I thought it was just flattery. Marcus joined the company 2 years later, fresh from Harvard Business School, and radiating the kind of confidence that only comes from never having faced real adversity. Charla Sr. made it clear that his son would eventually inherit control of Blackstone Financial, but in the meantime, he needed to learn the business from the ground up. The problem was that Marcus had no interest in learning. He wanted to lead, to make decisions, to be recognized as the heir apparent, without putting in the work to understand what he would be inheriting. He gravitated toward the flashy aspects of the business, the high-profile mergers, the celebrity clients, the deals that made headlines in the Wall Street Journal. The offshore work, the real foundation of Blackstone's wealth and power, bored him. It was too subtle, too complex, too removed from the immediate gratification he craved. So Charla Sr. made me the de facto head of international operations, reporting directly to him while Marcus focused on domestic investments and public relations. For 3 years, this arrangement worked perfectly. Marcus got to play the role of dynamic young executive, schmoozing with clients and giving interviews to financial magazines. I got to build what became the most sophisticated offshore financial network in the industry, a web of accounts and entities so complex that even I sometimes had to consult my encrypted notes to remember how all the pieces fit together. The Swiss accounts were the crown jewel of the operation. 17 numbered accounts spread across 4 banks in Geneva and Zurich, containing everything from acquisition funds for hostile takeovers to personal wealth shelters for the firm's highest net worth clients. The account numbers themselves were meaningless without the corresponding authentication codes, and the codes changed monthly according to a pattern that I'd developed using a combination of astronomical data, prime number sequences, and personal details that only I knew. It was elegant, secure, and completely dependent on my memory and my continued cooperation. Charla Sr. understood this dependency, which is why he'd gradually increased my compensation to the point where leaving Blackstone would have meant taking a significant pay cut anywhere else. It's also why he'd made me a junior partner last year, giving me a stake in the firm's success that went beyond my salary. But Marcus saw my growing influence as a threat to his inheritance. He began questioning my decisions in meetings, suggesting to his father that my methods were unnecessarily complex, that the offshore operations could be streamlined and standardized. He brought in consultants who promised to create automated systems that would reduce the firm's dependence on any single individual. What Marcus didn't understand was that dependence wasn't a bug in the system I'd created, it was a feature. The complexity wasn't accidental, it was intentional. The personal relationships I'd built with bankers in Geneva and Zurich weren't inefficiencies. They were the foundation of trust that made the entire operation possible. But understanding nuance had never been Marcus's strength. He saw only what he wanted to see: a senior employee who was getting too comfortable, too influential, too threatening to his eventual control of the company. The final straw came 3 weeks ago, during a board meeting where we were discussing the Meridian acquisition. I'd recommended against using the Swiss accounts to fund the deal, arguing that the regulatory scrutiny around large tech acquisitions had intensified since the government started cracking down on offshore tax avoidance. Marcus disagreed, publicly and condescendingly. "Elena's always been overly cautious," he told the board, smiling that practiced smile that somehow managed to be both charming and dismissive. "Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to maximize returns." I tried to explain the difference between calculated risks and reckless exposure, but Marcus had already made up his mind. Worse, he'd convinced his father that my caution was actually cowardice, that I'd become too comfortable in my position to push the boundaries that had made Blackstone successful. The Meridian deal went through using funds from 3 of the Swiss accounts. The acquisition was successful, the regulatory scrutiny never materialized, and Marcus looked like a visionary while I looked like someone who was losing her edge. That's when I knew he was going to make his move, so I made mine first. 3 weeks ago, the same night the board approved the Meridian funding structure, I flew to Geneva. Ostensibly, I was there to oversee the fund transfers and ensure everything went smoothly. In reality, I was there to implement the most elegant insurance policy I'd ever designed. I met with Heinrich Müller at Credit Suisse the next morning. Heinrich had been my primary contact for 5 years, a meticulous Swiss banker who understood both the letter and the spirit of financial privacy laws. Over coffee at a cafe overlooking Lake Geneva, I explained my situation. "I believe there may be changes in the leadership structure at Blackstone," I told him carefully. "I want to ensure continuity of service regardless of personnel changes." Heinrich nodded thoughtfully. Swiss bankers were accustomed to political instability among their clients. "What do you propose?" "Enhanced authentication protocols for all major accounts, biometric confirmation, rotating security codes, and, most importantly, a single point of authorization for any changes to the access structure." Heinrich raised an eyebrow. "You want to be the sole authorized agent for modifications?" "I want to be the sole authorized agent for everything," I corrected. "Withdrawals, transfers, account closures, password changes, even balance inquiries. Nothing happens without my personal approval." It was an unusual request, but not unprecedented. Heinrich had seen enough corporate coups and family feuds to understand why a trusted financial manager might want to protect both the accounts and herself from internal politics. The paperwork took 2 days to complete, requiring signatures from Charles Sr. as the primary account holder and my authorization as the designated financial proxy. Charles signed everything I put in front of him, trusting my judgment as he had for 7 years. The new protocols would go into effect at the end of the month, giving me a 3-week window before my protection became active. Marcus fired me with 2 days to spare. Now, standing in the elevator as it descended toward the lobby, I checked my phone again. 2:52 p.m. Eastern Time, 8:52 p.m. in Geneva. The banks were closed, but Heinrich would be checking his secure messages before tomorrow's opening. I composed a brief text in the coded language we'd developed over the years of working together. "Autumn protocols now in effect. Recommend heightened security posture for all managed accounts. We'll contact tomorrow to discuss winter arrangements." Heinrich would understand. The autumn protocols were our code for the enhanced authentication measures. Winter arrangements meant I was no longer operating under normal corporate authority. By tomorrow morning, anyone trying to access the Swiss accounts would discover that Elena Rodriguez wasn't just a recently fired employee. She was the only person on Earth who could unlock $847 million in frozen assets. The elevator reached the ground floor, and the doors opened to reveal the bustling lobby of Blackstone Financial. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and enough fresh flowers to stock a small wedding. It all radiated success and permanence. The kind of atmosphere designed to make clients feel confident about entrusting their wealth to the firm. But I knew better than anyone how fragile that confidence really was. Wealth built on secrets was only as secure as the people who kept those secrets. And secrets held by someone who'd been betrayed had a way of becoming weapons. I walked across the lobby with the measured pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and all the time in the world to get there. Tomorrow would bring panic, desperate phone calls, and probably a stream of visitors to my apartment. But tonight, I was going to order Thai food, pour a glass of wine, and enjoy the last peaceful evening I'd have for a very long time. Because I knew Marcus Blackstone Jr., and I knew he wouldn't handle losing gracefully. The war was just beginning. The call came at 6:47 a.m., jarring me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in months. I didn't need to check the caller ID to know who it was. Marcus Blackstone Jr. had probably been awake all night, frantically trying every password combination he could think of, calling every contact in Geneva, and slowly coming to terms with the magnitude of his miscalculation. I let it ring 4 times before answering, my voice deliberately calm and unhurried. "Good morning, Marcus." "Elena." His voice was strained, exhausted. Gone was the arrogant confidence from yesterday's board meeting. "We need to talk." "No, Marcus, you need to listen." "But I suppose that's progress." There was a long pause, and I could practically hear him grinding his teeth. Marcus had never been good at admitting mistakes, and this conversation was going to require him to acknowledge the biggest one of his privileged life. "The accounts," he said finally. "Heinrich says you're the only authorized party for any transactions." "That's correct." "This is insane, Elena. You can't hold the entire company hostage because you're upset about being terminated." I walked to my kitchen and began preparing coffee, the familiar ritual helping me maintain my composure. "I'm not holding anything hostage, Marcus. I'm simply the only person with the keys to accounts that your family chose to make entirely dependent on my expertise. You want to call that insane? Look in the mirror. My father wants to meet with you. Today? I'm sure he does." I measured coffee grounds with meticulous precision. "Tell him I'm available at 2 o'clock this afternoon. My apartment. And Marcus? He comes alone. You're in no position to make demands. Actually, I'm in the only position that matters. I'm the one holding $847 million in assets that your clients are going to start asking about very soon. How do you think they'll react when they learn their money is frozen because the CEO's son fired the only person who could access their accounts?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want? We'll discuss that this afternoon. Oh, and Marcus? Next time you decide to fire someone, you might want to understand what they actually do first." I hung up before he could respond and poured my coffee, savoring the rich aroma. Outside my window, Manhattan was coming alive with the usual morning chaos: taxi horns, construction noise, and the distant hum of millions of people starting their day, with the comfortable illusion that the systems they depended on were stable and predictable. They had no idea that one of the most powerful financial networks in the city had been paralyzed by a single woman's refusal to be discarded like yesterday's newspaper. This isn't about money, Charles. This is about justice. And trust. And the fact that your son tried to destroy me professionally while simultaneously stealing from the clients I've spent 7 years protecting. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where millions of people went about their daily lives blissfully unaware that their financial security depended on systems as fragile as human loyalty. "I want Marcus removed from Blackstone entirely," I continued. "Not transferred, not demoted, removed. I want a full forensic audit of every account he's had access to. I want public acknowledgement that the security breach was internal and that I discovered and prevented it. And I want a partnership stake that reflects my actual value to the organization, not the token percentage you gave me to keep me quiet." Charles set the folder aside and rubbed his temples. "Elena, you have to understand, Marcus is my son. My only heir. If I remove him entirely, then you'll have a company worth inheriting instead of a smoking crater where your reputation used to be." I turned back to face him. "Charles, I've spent 7 years building systems to protect your clients' wealth. Now I'm protecting it from your son. You can either support me in that mission, or you can watch everything we've built together disappear when the FBI starts asking why nearly $1 billion in client assets were nearly stolen by someone with no legitimate authority to access them. The mention of the FBI hit Charles like a physical blow. He understood better than anyone that financial crimes at this level attracted federal attention, and federal attention meant congressional hearings, media scrutiny, and the kind of regulatory oversight that could shut down even legitimate operations. "You'd really go to the authorities?" he asked. "I'd rather not, but if Marcus remains involved with Blackstone in any capacity, I'll have no choice. I won't be responsible for protecting assets that he's actively trying to steal." Charles stood and walked to my bookshelf, studying the titles as if they held answers to problems he'd never imagined facing. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man making the hardest decision of his life. "If I agree to your terms, if I remove Marcus and give you the partnership stake you deserve, what guarantee do I have that you won't simply disappear with the Swiss account access?" But the real victory came 3 months later, when Blackstone Financial announced the largest client acquisition in company history, a sovereign wealth fund from Norway that chose us specifically because of our reputation for security and discretion. During the final negotiation meeting, the fund's representative made a comment that crystallized everything I'd fought for. "We chose Blackstone because we know Elena Rodriguez personally guarantees the integrity of every account she manages. In our business, that level of personal accountability is worth more than any marketing campaign." Charles Sr. announced my promotion to Chief Operating Partner the same week, along with my new 50% ownership stake. The press release made sure to emphasize my role in preventing a significant security breach and my leadership in developing industry-leading offshore financial protocols. I kept the press release framed on my office wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that competence combined with courage could overcome even the most entrenched privilege. Marcus, meanwhile, took a position with a mid-tier investment firm in Chicago, where his Harvard MBA and family connections were enough to secure a decent salary, but not enough to grant him the kind of power he'd taken for granted at Blackstone. The last I heard, he was doing well enough, but his new colleagues had been warned about his tendency to overestimate his authority. Sometimes the best revenge is simply allowing someone to face the natural consequences of their actions. 6 months after what I'd come to think of as the Swiss account crisis, I received an unexpected visitor. Patricia Walsh knocked on my office door just as I was finishing a secure video conference with clients in Singapore. "Elena, do you have a minute?" Patricia had been my first mentor at Blackstone, the woman who'd taught me that financial services was as much about reading people as reading numbers. She'd also been conspicuously silent during Marcus's attempted coup, something that had bothered me more than I'd admitted. "Of course. Come in." She settled into the chair across from my desk, and I noticed she looked older than her 55 years, as if the stress of the past months had aged her prematurely. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble, "and an explanation." I leaned back in my chair, curious but cautious. Patricia had survived 30 years in financial services by being extraordinarily careful about what she said and to whom she said it. "Marcus approached me 6 months ago," she continued. "He said he was concerned about your judgment, that you'd become too conservative in your risk assessment. He asked me to document instances where your caution had potentially cost the firm profitable opportunities." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the same sensation I'd experienced during that final board meeting. "And did you?" Patricia looked down at her hands. "I compiled a report, nothing damaging, just observations about your preference for additional security measures and your reluctance to pursue certain high-risk opportunities. I thought I was helping Marcus understand your management style, but you were actually helping him build a case for my termination. I realized that too late. By the time I understood what he was really planning, the wheels were already in motion." Patricia looked up, and I saw genuine regret in her eyes. "I should have warned you, Elena. I should have stood up in that board meeting and told everyone what Marcus was really trying to do." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculated remorse. What I saw instead was a woman who'd made a mistake and genuinely wanted to make amends. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because you deserve to know the full truth about what happened. And because I want you to understand that not everyone who stayed silent was complicit. Some of us were just cowards." It was one of the most honest things anyone had ever said to me in a professional context, and it helped heal something I hadn't realized was still wounded. "Thank you, Patricia, for the apology and for the explanation." She stood to leave, then turned back. "Elena, what you did took incredible courage. I hope you know that." After she left, I sat alone in my office, looking out at the Manhattan skyline and thinking about the nature of courage. For most of my career, I'd thought courage meant taking calculated risks, making bold investment decisions, or standing up to difficult clients. I'd learned that real courage was simpler and more profound than any of that. It was the willingness to stake everything on your own competence, to bet your entire future on the belief that skill and integrity would ultimately triumph over privilege and politics. Marcus had taught me that lesson, though not in the way he'd intended. His attempted betrayal had forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, and to claim power I'd never imagined wanting. The Swiss accounts that had seemed like such a burden during the crisis had become the foundation of my independence. The relationships I'd built with bankers, clients, and regulators had transformed from professional obligations into personal assets that no one could take away. And the company I'd helped save from Marcus's incompetence had become something I truly owned, not just financially, but intellectually and emotionally. That evening, I treated myself to dinner at the same restaurant where Charles Sr. had first explained to me the importance of trust in financial services. As I raised a glass of wine to celebrate everything I'd accomplished and everything I'd survived, I realized that Marcus's betrayal had been the greatest gift he could have given me. It had forced me to stop being grateful for what others chose to give me and start demanding what I had actually earned. The waiter approached with the check, and I smiled as I signed it with my full name and new title. Elena Rodriguez, Chief Operating Partner, Blackstone Financial. Sometimes, the best way to win is to refuse to lose on someone else's terms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.